For me, the Banderites are worse than fascists. Even worse. It's true, even the SS men were shocked by what the Banderites did. Even those SS soldiers didn't commit such atrocities.
President Putin has now suggested former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder as a possible mediator. What about Mrs. Merkel?
Wouldn't be bad.
Why are German politicians driving their own economy to self-destruction?
This is a deliberate policy, and unfortunately, the goal of Pistorius and his allies is a military confrontation.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person. Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Wir zeigen Ihnen Positionen.
Hello, and welcome to Against the Current. We present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to hide. It's not the one who first takes up the sword who causes the disaster, but the one who forces him to do so. That's how Professor Vladislav Belov quotes the Italian politician and philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. Professor Belov is the head of the Institute for German Studies at the European Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Hello. Professor Belov, good to have you with us. How would you assess the current state of relations between Russia and Germany?
I'd put it the other way around. It's really between Germany and Russia, because the relationship is mainly shaped by Berlin. Russia stands for restoring the ties we built, step by step, over 19 years during the 2000s. And that period, less under Kohl, more under Schröder and Merkel, is now being sharply criticized. As for the relationship itself, politically, there isn't one. There are still some technical and consular services, but that's about it. Politically, everything's frozen. And the current executive power, so we're talking about the black-red coalitions, keeps driving the relationship further and further into decline.
Die Beziehungen immer weiter in die Tiefe zu bringen. Also die Russen sagen, dass man.
So the Russians say they've already hit rock bottom. They think they're at the lowest point, but then they hear knocking from the other side, meaning the relationship is sinking even deeper. We can see that happening in Russia, too. These calls are coming from the team around Merz. That includes Klingbeil, Wiese, Wadaful, and Pistorius, who's now visiting Kiev. It's also reflected in the coalition agreement, in what Merz said in his speech in the Bundestag on May 14th. 2025, and in the new Bundeswehr strategy. If I were to translate it carefully, it basically says, Russia is an enemy. Russia is an enemy, ultimately, politically, and in monetary and technical terms.
In der politischen, in der monetär-technischen Hinsicht. Was Wirtschaft angeht, die Beziehungen gibt es.
When it comes to the economy, those relationships do exist. There are more than 1,000 companies with German capital involved. And that works within the framework of the sanctions. I want to stress that. It works. There are still remnants of humanitarian and cultural ties. I'm also the vice president of the Russia-Germany Society, and we support those contacts on a European level as well. We organize joint events not only online, but also in person. In Vladivostok, for example, there are dialogues that include German participants. Recently, the political group held a meeting. The economic group met last year in Kaliningrad and Moscow. The next meeting is planned to take place in Tashkent.
Die nächste Tagung sollte in Taschkent stattfinden. Also die Beziehungen gibt, aber nicht.
So those relationships do exist, but not in the political sphere. The fault lies with Berlin. This is a deliberate policy, and unfortunately the goal of Pistorius and others is a military confrontation, most likely, we assume, through the Baltic and Scandinavian regions, meaning the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and so on. And the situation in that regard keeps getting worse. The goal has always been war, and I say that deliberately. War from this so-called collective West, the European West, a war against Russia. It's now being fought through Ukraine. It's not a proxy war, it's a real war. But the West would like to go further and actually start a war in the European part of our continent.
einen Krieg im europäischen Teil unseres Kontinents anzufangen.
US-Präsident Trump hat angekündigt,
U.S. President Trump has announced that he wants to withdraw American troops from Germany. He also doesn't want any Tomahawk missiles stationed there. Now, Pistorius has announced that he plans to buy those Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States.
Marschflugkörper in USA kaufen will. Was halten Sie davon?
Das Fortsetzung davon, was ich gesagt habe, das Ziel von
What do I think about that? It's really a continuation of what I've already said. Pistorius' goal is to make his strategy feel complete, and he's outlined 3 stages, 2029, 2030. By then, Germany is supposed to become capable of waging war. Not just capable of defense, as it said in the Social Democrats' Peace Manifesto from June 2025, but capable of war. And for that, of course, he needs a deterrence strategy. If Tomahawks were stationed in Germany, Putin would be nervous too, and he wouldn't achieve what Pistorius is calling for. And I want to stress that, not what Putin says. Putin says, former partners, please come to your senses. Please think clearly. Russia will never move forward once the conflict in Ukraine is settled. And it's already clear that the war in Ukraine shows what modern warfare looks like, and that without nuclear weapons, it's impossible to achieve a clear victory in a conventional war.
eindeutigen Sieg zu haben.
Sie haben gesagt, die Bundesregierung.
You said the federal government wants war. Why would it want that? Putin has always emphasized that he doesn't want to attack Germany. Lavrov, the foreign minister, has said the same. So where does this desire for war come from?
Also außenpolitisch einen Feind zu haben, ist der einfachste Weg.
In foreign policy, having an enemy is the easiest way to build certain victories. When it comes to China, it's both a partner, a competitor, and an opponent. The Americans are competitors and partners, so less of an opponent. And Russia is an opponent, an enemy. That's the easiest way to justify higher military spending, which was agreed on at the NATO level last summer. By the mid-30s, 3.5% of national budgets for defense. But I ask, defense for what? For war and for preparing for war. Another 1.5% goes to maintaining infrastructure. The Germans know much better than I do what the modern railways, highways, bridges, and so on mean in Germany. It's all about interconnection. Interconnection between the state and oligarchic capital. Read Hilferding from 1916. Financial capital, yes, financial capital. And that's where Lenin built his theory of imperialism, based on Hilferding's work.
And it says that the state and the financial elite, the top levels of capital, are becoming more and more intertwined and working together.
3.5% of the current 4.3, 4.4 in nominal GDP. If we take those percentages, the further we go, the more it becomes. So, when we're talking about 200 billion euros, of course that's a significant amount. A slice of the pie. And the next name I haven't mentioned yet is the CEO of Rheinmetall. This isn't an investment recommendation for Rheinmetall stock, but Armin Paperger is basically saying, Mr. Putin, please keep the war going. Mr. Putin, please keep supporting my shares. And please, don't make drones in your kitchens. That's my business. My bread, says Armin Paperger. And that's where I see the connection between two particular friends, Paperger and Pistorius. And Pistorius is in Kiev to discuss exactly that Rheinmetall and others, more than 1,000 companies in this industrial complex, are getting that contract.
The explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline, which the American journalist and investigator Seymour Hersh attributes to his own country, the United States and its government, along with the sanctions against Russia, has sent the German economy into a downward spiral. So, is the idea now to try to stop this deindustrialization by ramping up defense investments?
Basically, if we look at September 22, Gazprom actually stopped delivering gas because of the compressors. And in fact, the German engineers acknowledged that, even those from Siemens, that without the compressors, which were supposed to be shipped from Canada to Russia, but never arrived, it really was a technical problem. It was a technical problem. As for the explosion, I believe it was also part of a long-term strategy by the Americans to make sure Germany wouldn't return to the agreement between Biden and Merkel from July 2021. Biden had promised that Nord Stream 2 would go into operation.
Nord Stream 2 sollte in Betrieb genommen werden. Für jeden Fall, also lassen wir das auch sprengen.
But in any case, let's say we blow that up too. One line still remains. That one is, let's call it number 4. Though people say, no, that wasn't number 4, it was the third one, or whatever, the one from 1902, meaning from now on. The station, the compressor, is on the Russian side, and it was built by Russian engineers. Over more than 2,300 kilometers, even a single station can keep the gas flowing. So we'd take half of the 55 billion, that's 27.5 billion. But it's been shown it could actually deliver more than 28. And then the Americans step in and say, wait a minute. The rules of the game have changed. And so they're saying, for heaven's sake, no. The Americans, who would actually like to buy what's left of Nord Stream, meaning invest in it and supply it with Russian gas, well, the Americans say, no, that should be shale gas from the US, and the costs should stay high. And that brings us to your question, deindustrialization. That means losing competitiveness because of costs, not because of quality, but because of costs. Made in Germany always stood for quality plus reasonable costs, and that combination made it strong. I found that affordable.
Genug preiswert. Das fand ich billig. Also da sollten wir sagen, einfach die Preise waren auch langfristig orientiert.
We should say that prices were also set with a long-term perspective. They were stable and predictable. They weren't low, but they were definitely manageable. And the Americans say, we're the ones with a competitive location. Now, the Russians don't like that word, but I'm trying to introduce it as a concept. Then Trump says, America forever. And now, raising tariffs on the automobile and automotive industry from 15 to 25%. That means several billion in losses for the German car industry. And what does Trump actually say about that? Nothing personal. I'm talking about the fact that we've invested $100 billion in American production sites.
Amerikanischen Standorten investiert haben, you have to go to America.
Also Washington stärkt den Wirtschaftsstandort.
So, Washington is strengthening America's economic position by selling Germany overpriced fracking gas, blocking us from getting affordable Russian gas, and in doing so, effectively eliminating the German economy as a competitor. And that's really an action against German interests, carried out through willing helpers in our own federal government, isn't it?
Über Erfüllungsgehilfen in der Bundesregierung, oder?
Stimmt. Und für Industriestrompreis, was noch in Olaf Scholz Zeiten ausgedacht worden ist, das ist...
That's exactly the right answer. Nothing personal.
Warum?
Why are German politicians driving their own economy to self-destruction?
Ich werde anders sagen, wir sollten auch
I'd put it differently. We should let Germans vote for the parties whose representatives actually do that work. I mean, Merz isn't elected by the people, and neither is the president. The popularity of, well, that's the point. The popularity of Merz is extremely low, unlike Pistorius. Because we Germans, we're a nation that believes order has to be maintained. That old Prussian culture is still there. So a strong army, a strong Bundeswehr, not in the sense of wanting war, but in the sense that there has to be order. And through countless defense ministers, including the women who held the post, none of them managed to achieve that up to this point. That's why it's become so incredibly popular. But then again, they dropped below 50% because of that stupid mandate. 3 months, I'm not going to say more, everyone knows what I mean. Yeah, that's the kind of politics where Merz has, 13-15% popularity, and the government's approval is basically below the belt. Germany's strength, the strength of our economy, is still there. I mean, there was even talk of some kind of agreement between the business community and Merz. July 2025, Made for Germany, a kind of national industry dialogue. But who's talking about that now? At the Hanover Fair, a few companies mentioned it. Where's the initiative? Where's Merz's so-called autumn of reforms? He once said it would come next fall.
Is the federal government serving the interests of a foreign power, namely Washington?
Pretty much, yes. So Merz was the one who convinced von der Leyen to make that arrangement with Trump at the end of July 2025. It was then signed at the end of August, and so far the European Parliament hasn't clarified it. What kind of agreements are we talking about? The tariffs, where the rates weren't supposed to stay at the same level. Then there were supposed to be 15% for the auto industry, and so on. In that deal, Europe, or rather, the European Union, committed to investing $100 billion in the American economy, meaning in U.S. production sites, and to buying military goods and chips. That was the deal. But Merz was behind it. And let's also remind people what Merz was doing in America back in June. We'll find out more about that later.
Das wissen wir dann auch später. Im März ich spreche nicht von BlackRock.
In March, I'm not talking about BlackRock here. I actually have respect for all politicians, including Merz. Politics is really hard work, and I can see how Merz is trying to become a chancellor. But there was this really nice photo of Merz as a little boy sitting at a table, and well, without big challenges, no one becomes a great chancellor. And so far, Merz hasn't grown into that role. That's a problem. We can say it's also about dependence on the Americans and so on, but in the end, it's a competition between different locations. Germany is a location that's now in crisis, not in terms of GDP, not because of 0.5% this year, so not a recession, but as a business location, it's in crisis.
Ist in der Krise. Es gibt nicht Dialog oder ein Dialog, der auch zu Ergebnissen führt.
There's no real dialogue, or at least no dialogue that actually leads to results between the executive branch and groups representing interests, business, science, education. Then there's also the state level, where even that 1,000 mark, 1,000 euro measure, otherwise it would have been 2,000 marks, 1,000 euros, was stopped. So the interests just aren't being taken into account. That's why the location is in crisis. But the American one isn't. And then there's China and other locations that Germany and the EU are competing with. The art of politics isn't to put something down on paper, it's to make it happen. And that's Germany's problem. We don't have the kind of efficient politicians and civil servants who actually follow through on their decisions.
Die ihre Beschlüsse zu erfüllen sind. Wo wir jetzt Konflikte sehen, Reiche.
Where we're seeing conflicts right now is between the ministries, not the rich, but the ministries, and Klingbeil, the Ministry for Economic Affairs and the Finance Ministry. Only the federal ministry has really been successful, where, under the location strategy, starting in April 2024, companies were also asked to get everything in order. The military economy is running well. They've cleared the obstacles between contracts and production. So yes, there are some successes, but not in the civilian sector. We also talk about the idea that Germany as a business location should have technological sovereignty, digital sovereignty, strong cybersecurity, and so on. But at the moment, Germany is struggling in all of these areas.
In allen diesen Hinsichten hat Probleme.
Is the reason a kind of preemptive submission to American interests, or is Washington forcing its junior partner, Germany, to harm itself?
Sich selbst zu schaden.
Also eigentlich, ich habe schon jetzt vielen Dank für Ihre Fragen, weil
Well, actually, thank you for your questions. Social news is interesting to me because it forces people in a conversation to think, not about the Nachdenkenseiten, but about thinking itself as an idea. I believe Merz is one of the few Germans who still truly relies on the transatlantic partnership. But no matter what Trump says, Merz defends him. He can be tough again, but always very cautious. And even when Trump pushes back, Merz says, okay, I'll keep working with him.
Ich mache das mit ihm weiter. Deutschland wird bestraft mit 25%, nicht die EU, sondern Deutschland.
Germany is being punished with 25%. Not the EU. Germany itself is being punished with 25%. So Trump is punishing Germany with those other measures as well. He's enjoying it because everyone in Washington has shown Merz, the chancellor, who's really in charge. It was only Trump speaking there, and right in front of the chancellor, he joked, "Why haven't we punished them yet?" Meaning with economic sanctions. We should keep doing that. That's the situation. And that's why Germans should be asking Merz a very clear question.
Die Deutschen eine klare Frage an Merz stellen. Herr Merz, mit wem sind Sie?
Mr. Merz, whose side are you on? You said that the increase in defense spending and the course of the war are being orchestrated, organized, and coordinated at the NATO level. So would it be fair to say that Washington is now turning the war in Ukraine into a European matter through NATO, so that Europe keeps Russia occupied from the West, while the United States can focus on other conflicts?
sich selbst anderen Konflikten widmen können.
I think so. The term Europeanization is quite concrete. We talk about the Europeanization of NATO and the NATOization of Europe. We understand Europe as the European Union plus the rest of Europe, Britain, Norway, and the other countries that belong to the European part of NATO. Because we're a Europe institute, not an EU institute, since Europe is much larger than the EU and its partners. That's why we also talk about the NATOization of Europe. And we should look at how many billions from Europe are going to Ukraine through the United States. And of course, if something happens, it should be the EU that bears responsibility, meaning the European parts of NATO, not Trump.
Dafür haften, als europäischer Teil von NATO und nicht Trump. Die sagen also, wir haben alles dafür gemacht.
So they're basically saying, we did everything we could. You're obligated to buy weapons from us. Our weapons are much better than yours. But they don't actually have those weapons yet. Even today, they're still hoping to have some kind of miracle weapon by 2039. That's what they mean by Germany's technological supremacy. It reminds me a bit of 1944, 1945, when Germany also hoped to achieve that kind of technological superiority. It's nothing personal, just a target set on America, without taking any responsibility for what's happening in Ukraine. And why does the conflict in Ukraine keep going? Because Putin remains the target and Russia remains the target.
Putin als Ziel, Russland das Ziel bleiben. Sie möchten Russland schwächen und wenn sogar jetzt auch Putin hat wieder.
They want to weaken Russia, even now. But Putin has reached out again. He said, I am ready. He's never refused to hold talks. So yes, Putin is open to negotiations. But to really understand what the West, including Germany, doesn't like, we have to look at the reasons and causes behind what happened in Ukraine in 21, 22, or even back in 2014, right in the middle of Europe. If you don't understand that, I'd even go further. You also need to understand what happened in the Soviet Union in 1991. And I want to remind you, the people of Germany, that the Republic of Crimea was re-established on February 12, 1991, after a referendum.
Neu gegründet nach dem Referendum. Also genauso der reine Zufall.
So, just by coincidence, 70 years after 1921, that was the first republic, the Crimean Republic. And in 1991, that was the return to the republic. From that date on, after the decision by the Soviet parliament, Crimea left Ukraine. And when Zelensky says we should go back to the borders of 91, then Zelensky should also know that as of February 2nd, the Republic of Crimea was not part of Ukraine. Yeltsin gave it back, but the Russian parliament, Russia's parliament, never adopted or accepted Yeltsin's decisions, and in 1993, it was shot at. For Germans, that's almost impossible to imagine, taking the parliament building under fire with tanks. Yeltsin did that.
Unter Beschuss zu nehmen. Yeltsin hat das gemacht. Und das ist auch dann die Antwort von Putin.
And that's also Putin's response in that situation, back in 1994, when the Republic of Crimea disappeared. It became part of Ukraine again. At that time, Putin tried to handle it in a peaceful civil way. I recently saw on Russian television those joint parades of Ukrainian and Russian military units in Kiev, together, side by side. That was the hope, that we'd move forward on the same path, Russians and Ukrainians together. But then came February 2014, and that was a very clear signal from the West. No, Mr. Putin. You mean the coup on the Maidan? Absolutely. Let's say, for example, Chancellor Merkel, November 2014, in Vilnius, where she offered to mediate, to bring Kiev, Moscow, and Brussels together through Berlin.
All of this is part of the long prehistory of the war, to which you say, Merkel saw the risks back in November 2013.
She understood where all this was heading. But back then, he got a very clear signal. No, we're going to do it. The decision was made in 2013.
And the signal came from Washington.
And I should say, London. So there are also Anglo-Saxons who have always worked together. And London represents American interests in Europe. And we should also mention Johnson in April 2022, when the agreement between Moscow and Kyiv.
Back then, Prime Minister Boris Johnson went to Kiev, and you could say, pressured Zelensky not to sign an agreement that was already ready to be signed.
Guys, Sie haben nicht verstanden, was wir angefangen haben. Wir führen den Krieg gegen Russland und nicht Russland gegen uns. Wir haben Russland ins Konflikt involviert und ab sofort, ab April, Russland wird das bekommen, was wir als Ziel haben. Regimewechsel und. Wladimir Putin hat am 9. Mai gesagt, es war ein riesiges Problem für uns. Es war unheimlich schwer, die Aufgaben zu übernehmen und dann eine Antwort zu geben.
It was right, so I'd put it this way. The West was almost on the verge of success, or could have been, hypothetically speaking, and actually was. And the West, just like Karl Marx described in the mid-19th century, for profit, capital will do anything.
Für Profit wird Kapital everything machen. Nichts Neues im Westen.
Nothing new in the West. And now Vladimir Putin is telling the West, yes, we are ready. Meaning that we see the same reasons and causes, but we can still reach an agreement. And that historical background can't just be ignored. We have to understand the history. I would say starting from 1991, definitely from 1991. That's 35 years of catastrophe. The West has always thought that when Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union a catastrophe, he was exaggerating. But at that moment, 25 million Russians were suddenly living outside of Russia. We should also look at the reasons behind that catastrophe. Back then, many of my German colleagues would tell me, Mr. Belov, what are you talking about? That's old history. It doesn't matter to us. It doesn't matter who prepared it. What matters isn't to say, yes, those are the reasons for all the bombs planted with time fuses across the post-Soviet space. And very few people know, just briefly, Tajikistan. The civil war there, about 200,000 dead. And so many Russian Germans came from Tajikistan. You can talk to them. They can tell you what happened. The Karabakh War, Transnistria, Gagauzia, Abkhazia, Adjara. These are all conflicts that came out of the unresolved problems of the Soviet space. But the West tells me, that's not important. Let's just leave it. Better to talk about Zelensky now. Yes, says the West. That's right.
Part of this Western amnesia, this forgetfulness about history, is the long prehistory of the war that you mentioned. The fact that not a single problem that arose from the collapse of the Soviet Union has been resolved.
But the war, let me add one more point. Many people have already forgotten why Gaddafi was outlawed in the first place, because he used heavy weapons against his own people. That's exactly what Poroshenko did on June 2nd, 2014. This so-called anti-terror operation with aircraft and heavy ammunition, Zelensky continued it.
those who opposed the anti-terror operation that was directed against the population in Donbas.
Yes, but that wasn't a police operation. That was when thousands were killed, with airplanes and so on. The Gaddafi case. Actually, Poroshenko and Zelensky should be on trial. Wherever that happens, doesn't matter. But starting in 2014, those two are criminals. Their signatures are there, at least Poroshenko's. Back then, I even found the documents only in Ukrainian, but it's all there. The documents exist, and that's why Donbas wanted autonomy. In fact, Putin and Russia always supported autonomy within Ukraine's constitutional framework. Religion, the Russian language, I don't even recall that being an issue. But as I said, even after 2014, Putin proposed a peaceful solution, and the West said no.
After the Western-backed regime change on the Maidan in February 2014, the people in the Donbas rose up against the new government and came under fire from the Ukrainian army and far-right militias, even with heavy weapons. What happened after that?
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows how things will go from there. There are different ideas for possible transitional models. Some people even talk about two Koreas, and so on. The main point is, the Russian constitution is the Russian constitution. Crimea has always been independent, at least since 1991. And that's why Ukrainians should stop talking about it altogether. Now people are talking about the Donbas regions, and those should remain within Russia's constitutional framework. I assume these will be transitional models, and they could last for decades. The main thing is, there have to be guarantees. There should be guarantees. People talk about a European architecture that works without Russia, but that doesn't exist. And he should accept that. The main thing is, no one's shooting. But with what we call the Kyiv regime, so with Zelensky, under Zelensky, that's not going to happen. This regime, which developed over more than 10 years with those Bandera ideas and ideologies, in my view, unfortunately, can't be approached and isn't capable of negotiating right now. But that doesn't change the basic point of what Putin is saying. At the very least, a dialogue should begin. And Germany isn't ready for that. The kind of proposals Genscher always made, talks held below the political radar or out of the mass media spotlight, that was also the approach of the foreign minister back then. And Germany has clearly rejected that. And that's the problem. Germany says, on the one hand, we should. Well, Putin doesn't want to, but we do. That's a lie. Berlin right now, as I've already said, is not just unprepared, it's unwilling to start talks with Moscow, or at least with the Sherpas, or whatever they're called, the ones who negotiate quietly behind the scenes. And I know that so far that's not happening. Berlin really needs to change its approach. Otherwise, let me put it this way, if that doesn't happen, it's already criminal. Criminal for the Germans, for Europeans, for everyone. Because the war in Ukraine right now is one of those conflicts that
Professor Belov, why is Berlin escalating the conflict in Ukraine? Is that for economic reasons?
Less so, because even then it's still about the economy, not just the economy itself, but also about Kretschmer, the Prime Minister of Saxony. There are no reasons not to have economic relations with Russia. All those claims that everything would automatically go toward the war are simply wrong. We should go back to 2021, when Washington and London decided that the regime in Russia had to be changed, and Merz, together with Klingbeil and others, confirmed that. It's written right there in the coalition agreement. But then, if we look at Pistorius' latest strategy from April 22nd, it says, enemy A must be destroyed, and that enemy is Putin.
Russland sollte dann auch in einzelne Teile zerlegt werden.
Russia should then be broken up into separate parts, they say, to deal with the outside world. It's a project involving Russian citizens from different regions, organized along national lines. So they're saying each region should be independent, and so on. In other words, it's an anti-Russia project. Russia is inconvenient. Russia, with its values, Christian values, conservative values, serves as an example, as a place with its own position, a space that's attractive. It's no coincidence I've mentioned Merkel several times today, but she also said that thanks to Russia, European culture and mentality reach all the way to Vladivostok. Actually, you could add another 2,000 kilometers to that.
Eigentlich sollte noch 2000 Kilometer hinzufügen. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, das sind noch zwei Zeitzonen.
Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. That's 2 more time zones. When we talk about Vladivostok, I always say, hold on a second. Let's not forget Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, where the time zone starts even earlier. That should be taken into account too. And Germans need to understand that Russia is enormous, 17.2, roughly speaking, over 17 million square kilometers. But 75% of it lies in the European part, and the rest is down in the underbelly. In the south and in the north, there are only a few settlements. Because even cities like Novosibirsk, Yekaterinburg, and the other big ones, if you look at the map, they're all in the south. And then Germans say, Vladislav, such a huge country, that's dangerous. Why would it be? They just don't understand it.
Die verstehen den nicht. Aber die verstehen, dass wenn der Krieg...
But they understand that once the war is over, Russia will come back as a competitor, a political competitor, not an economic one, because economically it's a partner, a competitor to people like Mers or Klingbeil. At first I thought maybe that was just propaganda, and I tried to explain why they were acting that way. But the more I see, the clearer it becomes. This is real hatred, real rejection, a genuine belief that Russia is the enemy. But if we look closer, the enemy is Putin. The enemy isn't me, and it's not my family. The real enemy is the Kremlin.
Auch meine Familie. Der Feind ist richtig Kreml.
Do you see politicians in the West taking the attitude that they finally want to get revenge for the defeat at Stalingrad?
Weniger. Also das ist genauso nicht, dass es hat weniger...
Less so. I mean, that's not really it. It has less to do with history. I'm talking about Stalin's history. Maybe it's more about this anti-Russian attitude, though not from everyone, of course. If we had actually conducted surveys, I think, with properly phrased questions, properly, not just right, because right and proper aren't the same thing, then I'd say that hatred isn't something inherent to Europeans. Europeans are all different. Of course, there are European passports, but obviously Greeks, Norwegians, and so on, they're all different. And then there are the theories from companies and from other cultures. These are, of course, different cultures. And among these cultures, there will also be different attitudes toward Russian culture. And don't forget, Russia has about 200 cultures, nations, nationalities, or peoples, whatever you want to call them, with their own languages, their own literature, and so on. Russia is I don't really like the word, but Russian culture is a leading culture, and not by accident. Putin says it doesn't matter who I am, Ukrainian, Jewish, German, I am Russian. That's the mentality, the Russian mentality. We're not a Rus Federation, we're the Russian Federation, the federation of Russia's regions. And that's also part of Russia's strength. My mother was from eastern Ukraine, my mother-in-law from western Ukraine. Both, unfortunately, have passed away. But my mother-in-law, she helped raise our children. The fathers are Russians, from Russian regions too, and my wife and I always laugh about that. Of course, it's a tragedy. Our relatives are on both sides of Ukraine, in the east, right on the front line, where people are suffering, and also in the west. So the family is split on both sides. It's terrible. It's terrible. And the ideology in Western Ukraine is terrible. We're hated there. So far in Russia, people still make a clear distinction between Zelensky and his circle and ordinary Ukrainians. But in Ukraine, it's often just the Russian, like my grandmother used to say, or as people say now, kill the Russian, the way they said kill the German in World War II. It's awful. The Russian is seen as the enemy, and turning another people into an enemy, that's a crime. And the West keeps silent about it.
Ein Gegner zu machen. Und der Westen verschweigt das.
Und der Westen verschweigt noch viel.
And the West is keeping quiet about a lot more. For example, the suffering that so many people went through on Ukrainian soil after 1945, something your family also experienced.
Wir sprechen, meine Familie kommt von...
My family comes from Volodymyr Volynski. Volyn, that's Volhynia, the region that historically kept shifting back and forth between Poland and Russia. In 1931, Volhynia became part of the Soviet Union again. And the stories my relatives told my wife's family, better not to repeat them. Horrible. I need to take a breath here. Truly terrible stories about what the Banderists did. Even my father-in-law went through some of those raids after the war. Dozens, thousands of Soviet citizens were killed up until 1955. For 10 years. Killed by Ukrainian fascists. Fascists. I call them Banderists, and to me they were worse than fascists, even worse. It's true, even the SS soldiers were shocked by what the Banderists did. Even those SS men didn't commit such atrocities, didn't play such roles.
Diese Grautaten, Rollen nicht gemacht. Aber wie gesagt, also...
But as I said, the West, there's a reason I mentioned the background here. Did you know that Khrushchev visited all the Bandera people when he met with Adenauer? At that same time, not only did 10,000 Germans return to Germany, but Khrushchev also released all the Bandera followers. And historians and experts have shown that even then, they were always active in Ukraine, within the party system, and they were already preparing for the developments that took place after 1990.
That means there's continuity, right? That's correct. And that too was the order under the UK regulation from the West.
Von den 30er Jahren über die Sowjetunion hinweg bis heute.
Richtig, ist korrekt. Und auch das war der Befehl oder Ukas, Verordnung vom Westen.
Stop resisting and slowly work your way into all the power structures. And that's exactly what happened.
Das geschah.
Es gab ja einen Bürgerkrieg.
There was a civil war in Ukraine, supported by the West, backed by Western intelligence services, from 1948 until the mid-50s. And then came the order, better move into the institutions.
Nicht lieber, sondern das war richtig, das auch dann ist jetzt Schluss.
Not preferably. No, it was the right thing to do. And that was it. End of story. Khrushchev released them, so there was no point in continuing that way. We should have handled it differently. And the Bandera people, let's put it that way, they made their way into the structures, those hidden cells that were just waiting for their chance to take power. Then, in the 1990s, we saw how they slowly slipped into all kinds of institutions. That was especially dangerous in education. The Ukrainian language was never banned in Ukraine, never under any kind of prohibition. My wife speaks perfect Ukrainian, and her brother too. Both of them went to Russian schools in Ukraine, where my father-in-law was stationed for military service. They learned and studied Ukrainian in those Russian schools. I've always liked the Ukrainian language, the songs, the humor, all of it. We're one people. In that, Putin is right.
Wir sind ein Volk. Da hat Putin recht. Wir sind ein Volk.
Und umgekehrt.
We are one people. And the way they present it, there's not only a continuity of Ukrainian fascism, but also a continuity of the West's complicity with Ukrainian fascism. That's right.
Mit dem ukrainischen Faschismus.
Stimmt. Und da frage ich immer, wie kann man das akzeptieren?
And I always ask, how can anyone accept what's happening right now on the streets of Ukraine? The fascists are coming, those Bandera followers who are even worse than fascists, with the same slogans, the same goals. And the West says, that's the free Ukraine.
Das ist freie Ukraine.
They're defending Western values.
So killing children, if that's supposed to be part of someone's values, if that's accepted along with all the torture they carried out, or with those Azov people and the swastikas, well, I seriously doubt that belongs to any kind of values or added values of fascists. But yes, they turn it into some kind of added value. And it's a shame that this is accepted and that the crimes are being covered up. Everything is turned upside down when it comes to propaganda. The crimes are committed on the Ukrainian side, but at the same time, it's mirrored back. Their people did the same thing, mirrored, whatever. And people accept that the propaganda in Ukraine, the anti-Russian propaganda, is perfectly constructed.
Anti-Russische Propaganda ist perfekt aufgebaut. Mit allen Provokationen, mit Bucha etc.
With all the provocations, with Bucha, and so on. And the experts say, yes, that's the level, that's the standard. Of course, it's also clear who the teachers or the trainers are, and so on. Doesn't matter. And I'll say it again, the Ukrainian people are a talented people, just like any other. I didn't correct myself for nothing. We are one people. I deliberately quoted the Germans there. There's no such thing as the Germans. There are Swabians, Bavarians, and so on. Germany itself was formed from about 130 German peoples, with Bismarck. And what I like is that 1875 was a good year, because Konrad Adenauer was born then. I think it was 1875. That was a very good year, as Konrad Adenauer himself said. Yes.
Earlier you said Bucha was a provocation. How do you back that up?
Just one example. There are many like that. I didn't see any bodies with blue armbands. Strangely enough, they all had white ones, because that was always the sign. I'm here on the side of the Russian troops. The blue armbands were always worn by those who supported Ukraine. For the Russians, that was fine, no problem. So whichever armbands, but interestingly, what I saw, or have seen, were the ones who supported Russia. If Russians are killing Russians, I wouldn't comment on that.
Why did Putin pull back Russian troops in March 2022?
He understood that it was a provocation. He understood what the goal was, to have the war, to wage the war. And after heavy losses, he pulled the troops back. And let's not forget, the Russian troops could have taken Kyiv without much trouble. The troops were right outside Kyiv back then. And those were the ones who had organized things on the western side. That was very well coordinated, against Russia and in time. I believe that Merz, well, it was really Vladimir Putin and his people, I mean the general staff. They realized pretty quickly that it was a trap. And after that, they took constructive steps, despite all the insults and everything the Ukrainians did at the time. And then comes Bucha. And with Bucha comes the question, would the Ukrainians really be willing to do that? Bucha wasn't done by the Ukrainians. I mean, of course, it was carried out under the guidance of certain advisors or escorts or whatever you want to call them. Who were those advisors? I believe they were the British. Once again, the British are, let me put it carefully, a very well-prepared military and technical power here. They're really the experts in this kind of war, what's sometimes called a shadow war. And I'm not just talking about MI6, not about James Bond, but basically the British take pride in being perfectly trained and educated for this sort of thing.
The Russian troops then pulled back from the areas around Kiev, from the Kharkiv region, and also from places like Kherson. What happened to the people there?
As for the new territories that also received Russian passports, and the people who stayed there during Ukraine's offensive, I'm talking about Kherson and Zaporizhia, those two regions. According to my information, those who had Russian passports were basically doomed. In that sense, Obrichny, there's no real translation for that. They had no chance to stay. Killed, yes. How many? Nobody knows. And so far, even regarding the Kursk region, there are still no official numbers. It's being investigated, and everything will be made official. So it's not like those claims about 20,000 children. Just a number no one can confirm. The experts and so on, when it comes to the liberated areas, that's all being handled as well. When it comes to the areas still under Ukrainian occupation, the time will come to investigate that and to restore things, and to bring those responsible to a real court, not just these formal ones people in the West are talking about, where the crimes committed by Kosov or whoever else just get brushed aside, even crimes against their own soldiers who are shot. There are certain principles. Now they're talking about exchanging another 1,000 soldiers on each side, but taking prisoners isn't a crime. Yet there's so much evidence that when Ukrainian soldiers try to surrender, they're killed by drones. By their own people? By their own people.
Based on the information you have, what's the current state of the war in Ukraine?
Basically, Zelensky is trying to make use of this gift. It's not a loan, it's a gift. 90 billion euros that Ukraine received after the change of power in Hungary. So now Zelensky is significantly raising the salaries for mercenaries. But there aren't many people willing to go fight for the future Ukraine, even for that kind of money. The weapons are there, the hardware is there, but he's having problems with the soldiers.
You could say, once Ukraine is bled dry, the Germans will be sent to the front.
So let's just take that as a bad joke. But the resistance from Ukrainian soldiers is really strong. You can't say they don't want to fight. The reasons are different. Many people say, Vladislav, it's the drugs. The Ukrainian soldiers are addicted to the medications they're given. And there's propaganda too. They're told that if they surrender, they'll be tortured and killed anyway. The Russian army keeps advancing, but there are losses on both sides, including the Russian side, and not without reason. The Russian president says we should finally start having a dialogue, but in context, the Americans have said the war, or the military operation, has to keep moving forward. So how can you say a ceasefire will only happen when everything is really on the table? Until then, there won't be a repeat of April 22. The Russian army is having success now, and Kiev understands that very well. The strength is on the Russian side. So I'd put it this way. At the negotiating table, Zelensky is counting on the billions. He's relying on propaganda. He's counting on material support from the West, and Zelensky will never sign a peace agreement that benefits Russia, because for Zelensky, that would mean political death in Ukraine. And that's the problem. That's the problem, because Zelensky depends on the hawks. And the problem for Europe is that the troops, not only those at the front, but also the ones inside the country, are so strong that they pose a threat to Poland, to Hungary, and even to Vienna. I don't mean war itself, but rather those groups, those fighters, who are a danger to Europe, no matter what they're called.
Because they influence Europe. There's this idea of co-transformation, and the neighboring countries are also threatened by these fascist forces.
Right, and they're already here, let's say 7 or 8 million in Europe, and among them, there are enough idiots, and I say that deliberately, idiots. Although now, I could be threatened by them, just for calling them idiots. People who'd be ready to use those cells in favor of the Ukrainian regime, with threats like the ones against Orban. Brussels just swallowed that when Orban's family was threatened. And I believe that same danger exists in Europe, because of what Europe is willing to accept, from what's called the best army in the world right now, the Ukrainian one. That's one part. But there are also other parts, perfectly prepared for other kinds of operations. And that's dangerous. Those are the risks for Europe, not just for Russia.
Now, President Putin has suggested former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder as a possible mediator. Could that actually lead to something?
At least this brings Schröder back into the spotlight. We shouldn't forget that. It might mean that Germans should give an answer. And the first answer should be, definitely not Schröder. So it should be Steinmeier, the president who's actually leaving soon, in February next year. Why Steinmeier? Because, in a way, he's Russian. I've followed how he kept changing his position as foreign minister under Schröder's government, and later during Merkel's time, he gradually shifted from being pro-Russian to anti-Russian. Since 2014, he's clearly been an anti-Russian politician, an anti-Russian president, with a very active pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian policy. I'm sorry, but I used to know him differently.
But a president who's openly anti-Russian might not be a good mediator at all. What about Mrs. Merkel?
She's seen as a pro-Russian politician, even though she actually took a neutral position. Credit to Angela Merkel. She always said that Putin should be part of the dialogue. It wouldn't be a bad idea if someone, maybe you, Angela Merkel, made such a proposal. I'd support that. People used to make fun of me for that. They called me a Putin understander. And once, I think about 10 or even 11 years ago, right at the start of the conflict in Ukraine, I called myself a Merkel understander. Of course, there are Merkel understanders in Germany too, but I did that deliberately to say we should compare the so-called Putin understanders and Merkel understanders in the same way. I'm someone who tries to understand her motives and why she acts the way she does. Being a Merkel understander doesn't mean being a Merkel supporter, but we also need people who can serve as real experts.
Die Person verstehen, die an der Macht ist und zu Entscheidungsträger gehört.
You said earlier that the federal government wants a war against Russia. What do you say to the politicians here in Germany who want a war against Russia?
Die den Krieg gegen Russland in Deutschland wollen.
Da sollten Sie sich besinnen.
You should really think about that. Of course, there are experts like Masala who say certain things. The problem is, from my point of view, and I want to stress this, there are very few experts in the relevant structures that I have access to within the government. And no, I'm not going to name them for any reason. Let's just say that includes the various foundations as well. That's where the experts should be, the ones who are objective. But they don't exist, because being objective, well, the moment someone tries to be objective, they're immediately labeled as Putin sympathizers, or even worse, as traitors. That's what they get called. So I want to give credit to them, and also to the other German colleagues who take part in the Petersburg dialogue, who actually dare to come to Russia and talk with us. That's what I call civil courage. And my compliments to you and to everyone else who's doing the same, because there's really no other way. And thank God, part of what defines a strong place is its civil society. A strong community is one where people are willing to go against the current. That actually reminds me of a photo I saw in a newspaper about 10 years ago. It showed a strong fish swimming upstream. It was surrounded by smaller fish, all going the other way. And I'd say, a strong expert, a strong fish, should also be able to swim against the current from time to time and understand what that means.
Professor Vladislav Belov, der Leiter des Bereichs für
Professor Vladislav Belov, head of the Department for German Studies at the European Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences, says the German government wants war. And to prevent that, former Chancellor Angela Merkel is supposed to mediate. For that, many thanks. Here on Against the Current, we show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media try to conceal.
Perspektiven, welche die Propagandamedien verschleiern.